Welcome everyone and happy Valentine's Day. Welcome to the February 2022 edition of the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. A special thank you to our sponsors, Limmer Education and ESO, for making this possible. And the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum is dedicated to the promotion, education, and dissemination of pre-hospital research. And we believe it is the responsibility of emergency medical professionals worldwide to build a body of evidence to examine pre-hospital emergency care. And so here on the PCRF Journal Club, we're going to take a closer look at some of the latest research happening in EMS. I'm Remley Crow, and I am joined today by Dave Page, Dr. Tony Fernandez, Jeff Rollman, and Dr. Bill Toon. And it is my great pleasure to welcome first author of our paper today, Dr. Ginny Renkiewicz. So welcome. As a reminder to everyone, the name of the article that we'll be reviewing is Secondary Traumatic Stress in Emergency Services Systems, Stress Project, Quantifying and Predicting Compassion Fatigue in Emergency Medical Services Personnel, and this was just published in Pre-Hospital Emergency Care. As always, our discussion is paired with an article written by our very own columnist, Dr. Tony Fernandez, in EMS World called Journal Watch. So we encourage you all to check it out at emsworld.com under the category of education and training. I want to thank the audience for joining us today. And before we begin, let me just remind you that you can use the chat feature on your screen at any time to type in questions and comments, and we'll be bringing those into the live conversation as we go. And so with that, let's dive in. Dr. Renkiewicz, welcome. For our audience who may not know you and all of your wonderful work just yet, I figured we could start off with a little bit of an introduction. Would you mind telling us a little bit about who you are and how you got interested in EMS research?
Well, hello everyone. First of all, thank you guys for having me. It's so very awesome to be here. I think that my interest in research is partly Dave Page's fault, and then the rest of that falls on Dr. Michael Hubble. We did a PCRF research forum in our state's EMS conference about 10 years ago. And, you know, we were baby researchers then. And so, you know, we're up at 3 o'clock in the morning running our own stats. And, you know, I had no idea what I was doing. I was a first semester grad student. You know, I kind of knew how to run the test, but I had no idea how to interpret anything that I was seeing. So, you know, it's 3 in the morning. We're all hyped up on coffee. And I turned to Dr. Mike Hubble and I said, what does this mean? And he tells me, this is a very little cool factoid. And I realized that he and I were the only people on Earth who knew that little tidbit of information. And from there, I was completely hooked. We've now kind of developed our own little program that we do every year at the state conference to inspire folks to get into research, because it's not a 4-letter word, it's not scary, everybody can do it. And it really, that event changed the course of my life, because I was doing my grad degree while I was finishing my prereqs for med school. So then I decided I wanted to be a data geek, and I gave up med school to go for a PhD instead.
You joined the cool kids.
I did.
It's funny how our stories collide. I think I have Dave Page to blame for some of my research career as well.
No. Okay, this podcast is definitely going sideways here. I think you're the rock stars who see a vision, and we're better because of your efforts in that kind of space of what can we learn. And so I'm excited to talk about this, especially on Valentine's Day, because it's a little bit of love for our own mental health. And both of you have gone in that direction, whether it's about burnout in Remley's case, and here, Ginny, you've done such an amazing job. I think everybody should know that Ginny won Best Research in our PCRF 2022 International Scientific Symposium. And so that is awesome. And we have a call for abstracts out. So a shameless plug that these accomplished researchers that are talking today all want to welcome more new researchers. So can't wait for what comes next, but let's talk about stress.
Yeah, and speaking of stress, let's talk about, I believe this was part of your actual dissertation work. Is that correct? Perhaps you
It,
could tell
it,
everyone a little bit about, what it was like to pursue your PhD and to take this on as your topic. Why was this your topic? I'm curious.
that's a very personal question, whether you realize it or not. But I believe in being candid and honest and ending the mental health stigma. So I'm going to answer it honestly. I believe that the reason I selected this as my topic was to kind of understand where my own neuroses came from. I grew up in an interesting home environment. My parents love me. They are great parents. But there was substance abuse in my family. I experienced a suicide at a young age. There was depression in my family. And so, and I was a latchkey kid, in the 90s, your parents, both of them worked and nobody came home until 7 p.m. So you just had a key, and as long as you weren't dead or kidnapped, nobody really cared. And so, I started to wonder how that forms what I do as a clinician. I started my own mental health journey several years ago, probably about 5 years ago. And as I started to learn things about myself, I started to kind of understand how myself intersected with my role in EMS, and that it's very easy to blame the profession for what we see every day, because everybody on this podcast, I'm sure, has seen something that no human should ever have to see. But I feel like, blaming EMS is kind of low-hanging fruit. Yes, it is a huge problem. And our culture is a problem, and the lack of support is a problem. But also who we are when we come into the profession may also prime us to be more susceptible to this sort of stress. And so, I had a hard time, in my profession and in my own mental health journey, and I don't want that for others. So, as I continue to do my research, I focus more on the origin story. I'm not really into I will leave the, interventional stuff to other smarter people, but I really want to understand every facet of what makes us susceptible to these things so that we can target mitigation strategies that are really effective for people who are the most at risk.
That's such a powerful story. And thank you for sharing your personal experience and helping keep this research real. And I would say, you're not alone. There's lots of us who are benefiting from this kind of work, and it's so important. And so this is part of a much larger project. For those of you who don't know, the Stress Project has a lot of different arms. Today, we're going to be specifically focusing on the compassion fatigue section of this. And so could you set up for us just a little bit about, we hear compassion fatigue and we kind of get an idea in our minds of what it means, but I'd like to hear your definition of it and what helps differentiate it from these other conditions that we hear a lot about, things like burnout or PTSD or anxiety.
There's several different stress disorders. I think it's very easy to focus on, I'm going to start calling it PTSI. That's kind of a new movement to call it an injury, because it is a psychological injury, the same way that if you get out of the back of the ambulance and smack your head on the nadir pin and need stitches,
Yep.
It's a physical injury. This is a psychological one. But it's very easy to focus on that because everybody knows about it. We've been talking about PTSI or shell shock or combat fatigue or whatever for hundreds of years. But there are more subtle, more insidious disorders, now defined in the DSM-5 as trauma or stress-related disorders that, I'm hopeful that if we can kind of parse those out first, maybe we can keep people from developing into folks like me who have complex PTSI, and that's something that I will be dealing with my entire life. And I, like I said, I don't want that for other people. There's two types of stress disorders, right? There's primary, those are like the PTSIs. Vicarious trauma is a primary stress disorder. It can be acute. You only need to see one really bad thing and then you kind of break a little. With compassion fatigue, it is a slower, more accumulative stress disorder in which you are constantly stimulated by stressful events or critical incidents or whatever, and your body eventually loses the ability to cope properly with those events. I think the best, easiest example of that right now is if you've been on TikTok for more than 5 minutes, you've seen a healthcare provider complaining about all the people who aren't getting vaccinated, who are in the hospitals, and they whine about having to treat them. And that right there is compassion fatigue. They're kind of at war with themselves. They want to be the caring, compassionate provider that they've always been, but they're struggling internally because they are frustrated by this particular thing that keeps happening over and over again that they have no control of and can't do anything about. And eventually it takes its toll on them psychologically.
Absolutely. And I think it's so key to understand this phenomenon and how it's certainly related to other stress disorders. We see some of those links in the paper that we're going to be reviewing, but it is an important differentiation to talk about some of these things. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the objective of our study here. So this was to identify the prevalence of compassion fatigue. It hasn't been well understood or well described, and then to look for associated factors. And before we dive into the exciting results that you have, I'm going to invite Dr. Fernandez back to join us, and we're going to talk a little bit about the methods, because I for one, am a survey methods geek, and I am really excited to hear about some of those things that you took on. So Dr. Fernandez, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, Ginny, thank you so much for joining us today. And it is, I just want to say congratulations on your great work and a wonderful dissertation and set of studies. I'm really looking forward to talking about this one today. So let's dive in. So you had a cross-sectional survey design, and one thing that I do want to note was your data collection started in March 2019. There were some interesting things going on in the following year. So I'd just like to talk about, you had a really interesting plan for identifying not only agencies, but then getting your study population within your agency. So I'd love it if you could walk us through kind of how you went through those, identifying those agencies, how you selected them for participation in your research, and then kind of step us down to how'd you actually get to the providers who answered your survey?
Sure. So my survey was pretty long. It was EMS long. It was not psychological long. It was 105 items, which is EMS long, but a psychological long study would be like 300 to 500 items. But it's hard to answer 100 questions in a row, especially if you're sitting at a computer. So I really wanted to do those surveys in person, which meant that I kind of had to stay within the confines of my home state, which is North Carolina. But North Carolina is very interesting in that it has pretty much every geographical region you could think of. We have mountains, we have coastal Piedmont, we have tidewater, we have sandhills, we have I guess the low country, which is like the mountainous area before you get into the flat part. So we have all of that. We have large urban areas like Charlotte and Raleigh and Durham, and we have, really, really small rural areas and, hyper rural areas and everything in between. And so I wanted to make sure that my study was as what we call generalizable as possible, right? So that what that means is that we're trying to make sure that I'm not just pigeonholing myself by surveying one little tiny group of people, and then it, great, my results say this, but it means nothing in the larger scheme of things. So we approached 12 agencies that were in each, there were 4 each, rural, urban, and suburban, that we asked so that we could get that gamut, because I think it's very easy to say, well, of course, urban paramedics have more stress disorders. They run more calls. They're busier. They don't get time to pee or eat or whatever. And so I didn't want to pigeonhole myself there. And then each of those agencies represented a different geographic area, so that we could make sure that, you know, we included folks from the mountains all the way to the coast. And then I started in March of 19, and I physically went to all 9 of those agencies, every Con Ed session they had for a month. And I drug this little, I felt like a kindergarten teacher, right? I was dragging this little briefcase thing behind me with a lock on it that had all the surveys in it. And then I hand scored and coded every single one of them. So my data collection took me about 3 months, because I would do 2 agencies a month, roughly 2 to 3. Because some agencies have, you know, 4 or 5 Con Ed nights. You got to get to all of them. And then, you know, the summer I spent, you know, doing a lot of computer stuff in Excel. We became very close.
Yes, I think we all have a special relationship with Excel at this point. So let's talk about your survey. Your survey. I see Dave Page just popped in.
Yeah,
Dave,
no, I just wanted to interject because, you know, novice researchers out there sometimes are wondering about sending out a survey and talking about exactly which audience you're going to send it to and what kind of return rate you're going to get, and whether you're just going to go on to Facebook and ask 2 questions, or go on to SurveyMonkey and create an account and then suddenly get 1,000. Is really important. And so I actually love this approach, because what you did was, let's make sure we deal with rural, urban, but let's make sure we get a really good return rate. And I'm just going to go there physically and get these things filled out. And I think sometimes we forget, it's easy to create an electronic survey and then figure it out later. And then you really don't have a representative sample. And I really want to applaud you for just putting in that seat time, windshield time, driving to these places, because it really gives us a much stronger study, I think. So Tony can probably correct that, but you know, I just wanted to say that.
I would never correct the great Dave Page. So let's talk about your survey. So you mentioned earlier that it was, relatively speaking, a longer survey. And it was composed of a couple different surveys. And what I really like is that you didn't so much try and reinvent the wheel. You used some validated scales and surveys, and I think that was really smart. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you chose to put in your survey and how those fit together?
Sure. So the first 20 questions or so were demographic stuff, you know, income, do you have kids in the home? What's your combined annual income? You know, how old are you? What color are you? What's your highest education? I wanted to know sexual orientation. We asked about gender and not sex. Unfortunately, I didn't have occasion to run across too many transgender EMS providers. I think there were, you know, a handful in the study. So we couldn't use those results. And then after that, there was 4 or 5 questions on military history, because one of the projects was to tease out the impact of prior military service in EMS, which was published in JSOM a few months before, which is the Journal of Special Operations Medicine, a few months before this one got published. And then there was the ACEs questionnaire. So that is a 10-question yes, no on 10 different types of child abuse or adversity in childhood, as it's probably better. I should have called it that, which is physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, divorce, substance abuse in the home, mental illness in the home, suicide, or an incarcerated family member, or domestic violence. So those are the 10 categories. Did you experience any of that in childhood? Yes, no. Following that, and ACEs is, I mean, there's been, you know, probably a gajillion studies on the ACEs. Everybody uses it. So it's well known to be a stable instrument. And that's, you know, I had so many moving parts in this thing that was the one thing that I was like, all right, I don't want anybody to question the instrument. Let's just make sure that that's not questionable, and then we can deal with all the other stuff. So after that was the life events checklist, which is a 17-item kind of critical event scale, also used very often in psychological research, that it's not only did you experience this, but how did you experience it? Did you experience it directly? Did you witness it? Did you learn about it? Or was it part of your job? Because that way we can tease out, are these critical events really happening at work? They're happening in other places? Are we learning about them? Or are we experiencing them directly? Following that was the professional quality of life scale, which we used for this study to quantify compassion fatigue. And there's a cut score for that. So you're able to just kind of stick everything below that number and say, no, they don't, and everything above this number and say, yes, they do. And then the last one was the impact of event scale revised, which will give you vicarious trauma. And I should back up and say that one of the other subscales for the ProQOL will also give you burnout, which is a project that I'm currently working on right now.
Yeah,
so lots of stuff.
Yeah, a whole lot of stuff. Jeff, please jump in.
Thank you. Don't mean to interrupt you there, but just wanted to bring up something that you did. I mean, first of all, amazing research and definitely an honor to be on here with you. But what I really liked about this research is you viewed all of the participants not just as subjects and you're just trying to collect data and you're in and you're out. But what I thought was really interesting was you described about your resources. I mean, this is really difficult questions that you were asking, very highly sensitive nature. ACEs, I mean, talk about difficult subject matter. And you realize that this is something that there are many folks in the EMS community who unfortunately suffer from many of these issues. And you tried your best to provide resources. And what I thought was really interesting, yes, sometimes, folks will leave an 800 number, but you actually made a connection with the local counselor. So if you could just tell us a little bit more about that, since I think that's amazing how you really put so much effort into not just the research itself, but other aspects of it in your participants. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for your kind comments, Jeff. That you're going to make me blush. Yeah, so I think that if it were me and I were taking this survey and somebody gave me the number to the suicide hotline, I would ball that up and throw it in the trash. But there was a lot of very sensitive material, not just all the ACEs stuff, but there were questions on, whether or not the participant had ever experienced the suicide of an EMS professional, whether they had thought about it themselves, whether they had ever been in counseling for a stress-related event. So a lot of things that could really trigger and stimulate them. So I developed a kind of a resource sheet that was at the end of the survey that I encouraged them to tear off, which kind of had all the numbers, all the hotlines based on, like there was a veteran hotline, the suicide hotline, there was like a fire rescue network hotline. But then also, I'm gonna give a shout out to Helen Tripp. She's a licensed professional counseling associate who teaches a lot of CISM classes all around North Carolina. And she's still on the truck, actually. She's probably at this point, a 35-year paramedic. Wonderful, wonderful woman. And so I asked her, would it be okay if I put your contact information on that resource sheet so that there was a local resource that folks could reach out to if they, got triggered by this or really wanted to experience counseling. The first therapist I ever went to we had to spend like 30 minutes of the first session with him going, really? That's what you do every day? Really? Well, tell me about, I just can't believe that. That's insane. And then, the last 5 minutes was, well, give yourself a hug and tell yourself that you love yourself. I'm not kidding. So I just kind of went, bunk this. I'm not going back. And that's a lot of the first experiences for many of us. I really wanted folks who needed it to have access to somebody who understood what they experienced on the daily, so they didn't have to rehash the worst memory of their lives while somebody looked at them like they were a TV show. And that was very important for me in my therapy journey. Thank God I found somebody who was he was an ex-special forces chaplain of all things, turned therapist, and he didn't let me get away with anything because he knew everything about what I was exposed to. So that was more helpful for me and more comfortable too.
And, I really want to kind of expand on something that Dave Page mentioned earlier. You actually went to these agencies and administered this survey, which is a sensitive topic, in person, and that takes a different, a much different skill set than administering a survey online. And I'd imagine that sometimes this wasn't very well received. And I wonder if you can walk us through kind of some of the things that you encountered when you were trying to administer the survey to a population like ours.
Sure. I spent an inordinate amount of time making sure that I use the word anonymous as much as possible. I wanted folks to know that, don't put your name on it. I don't want to know who you are. And I would make a big point of, I had gotten some agency data from their training officers about calls that the agency had run the preceding year, because I was trying to look at what those numbers were in each area. And so I would give them the corresponding number for their agency and say, write that on the front of your sheet where it says agency number. That's it. You're tied to your agency, but beyond that, I have no idea who you are. And I made a huge point of having this random folder in my little lockbox, and I would just shove their stuff in it really without looking at it. So that, I think, helped. There was a visual cue, there was an auditory cue. A lot of people came up and thanked me and said that, they felt like this was important work, and they were glad somebody was finally looking at it. And then I had those folks who would have what I can only describe as a really hyper aggressive response, like tearing the survey in half, throwing it up in the air, cussing while they left the room. And ironically, those are the folks who probably should have taken it, because that overly aggressive response is actually a symptom. But there's a phenomena in psychology called anosognosia, which essentially is your lack of awareness, your lack of self-awareness of your own mental illness or moral injury. And it was that way for me. I thought I was fine. Everybody else was crazy, and me snapping at everybody on the daily was just normal behavior. And it wasn't until I really started understanding what this was all about that I realized that I totally had all this stuff and I just was oblivious to it. And so I think for some of those that had this really aggressive response, that's probably where they are too. But you can't change anyone, and if they want to change, they're going to have to take that step themselves, unfortunately.
Absolutely. So let's move in. I sometimes like to expand on the methods a little bit too much and hold us back from the really interesting results. But I'd be remiss if I did not talk a little bit about your analysis plan, and kind of if you can at a high level tell us how did you use these data to not only identify the proportion of the population who suffer from compassion fatigue, but how did you identify the predictors as well?
So I think we know that there's very, very little research in this area in EMS. And part of the reason why I'm so thrilled that I got to do this in North Carolina is that I didn't have really the influence of dual service. Now, I figured out if they worked in fire part-time, but North Carolina is a third service state, so I really got to look at the EMS only experience, and that was super important to me because I don't, I spent some time on a SWAT team, and I worked for a fire department, but I drove the boo-boo bus for them. I didn't put the wet stuff on the red stuff. So I really wanted to get that experience, and because there was so limited information out there, you can't build a predictor model when there isn't one to go off of, really. So the only way to do that is to try to figure out where the associations are, and then put those positive associations in a model and see how it all shakes out in the end. And so that's essentially, what I did. So lots of chi-square and t-tests and ANOVAs to just get the basic, is there a relationship here, yes or no? Okay, well, when you look at those two things in a vacuum, yes, there's a relationship, but now when you add in everything else, is it still significant? And so those positive, significant relationships were used to build the final model. And then we checked to make sure that model was predictive by doing what's called an area under the curve of the receiver operating characteristic to see how predictive the model actually was for this population too. Because it's, it's one thing if you get odds ratios that say, hey, if you're, if you make $20,000 a year, you're 86 times more likely to have compassion fatigue, but it's only predictive in 8% of the population. So, that's worthless.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can't wait to start discussing your results. Before I do, I'd like to turn it over to any other panelists who might have any methods related questions. And then let's talk about what you found.
Thanks, Tony. I don't have any further questions on the methods, but I do want to one more time commend the methodology on this, because Dave Page kind of mentioned it earlier, but survey methodology is one of those things that's deceivingly challenging, and you did a great job at making sure there was content and face validity in the items, and your sampling strategy was really important. So a lot of times we see convenient samples, which can be okay for exploring some things, but this is a much stronger way of seeing if these effects are likely going to generalize outside of the study population. And a participation rate of 86% is just unheard of in today's survey world. When I was at National Registry, we're getting in the teens, and if we're lucky, 20% if we offered all kinds of incentives. And so the time and effort that you put in really paid dividends, and very grateful for that work.
And it's reproducible, right? Because if I'm thinking, is this really happening just in North Carolina? Then maybe I just kind of leave it aside, and I can't quite do it again in my local area. So one of the beauties of this kind of recipe is that these methods can really, you could take them and reproduce them very easily, particularly if you're a QI person at an ambulance service who says, maybe we should actually see if our reality is similar to this. And of course, a multi-institutional study where we've got different people in different parts of the country. You could survey 10,000 EMTs and paramedics on Facebook, but do you really know that out of 400,000 or 1 million, these are representative? And I can't overstate what Remley just said. We can come up with all sorts of questions that are completely untried, untrue, and invalid, really. So the fact that you took scales that were already in existence is just really useful. So, well done, well done.
Yeah, and by going out to the stations and getting everyone to participate, you reduce that risk that only the really strongly opinionated people will answer. Because if you're posting a survey on Facebook about burnout, well, you're going to get people who are really into that topic one way or another, whether it's all the way on. So I think that this is, a very balanced look, and I think that's great.
And for people who are intending to publish their work, if you get, very low return rates, you're not likely to publish in a good journal, in a journal that has a lot of readership or prestige. So this is actually a really tightly controlled experiment that has consequences later. And again, if you're at a Con Ed session where like where I work, all of us do mandatory ed. So once a quarter, we could survey our paramedics about all sorts of things and get 100% return rate, other than just opting out for research purposes. So really like the way that you did that.
Absolutely. So consult a survey methodologist like a Ginny if you're going to be doing these types of work.
You guys have
let's
got to stop complimenting me, or I'm not going to be able to fit through the door when I leave.
That's the goal. You deserve that. So let's talk about the actual results here. We've got 686 EMS professionals across the state participated at the participating agencies. And the first thing that really, called out to me is that when you're looking for these things associated with compassion fatigue, it was broken down in certain areas. But first, perhaps it makes sense to talk about the proportion of providers that were found to be experiencing compassion fatigue, again, by a noted cut point, a validated cut point on that scale. And I was shocked to read 48%. And I'll be the first one who sits around and says, there's no medals in the burnout Olympics. Like you're not, EMS is more burned out or less burned out. But I am curious, was that finding surprising to you, or is it in line with what you may have expected given your literature review on this topic?
Well, there is no literature really on
on
EMS for sure, but I was depressingly surprised, if that makes sense. As a statistician, you get excited when you see numbers like that, but when you put those numbers in context, it was so awful to know that nearly half of the people that I surveyed are suffering in one way or another. So, there were things that I looked at and I was like, wow, this is really good data. And then I would go, wow, I might have to go home and cry into my Lucky Charms tonight because this is just awful. So I kind of had that dual response in all of it, really.
Yeah, and I think I had some of that just on reading it. It also goes to say that, for people who may be experiencing some of these signs and symptoms, you're not alone in the slightest. This is a widespread issue throughout the profession. And the next part of this study really starts to break it down into some of these risk factors or associations with who may be more likely to be experiencing these signs and symptoms, and might be areas where we can target interventions in the future. So when we go into the sociodemographics, I thought there were some interesting findings there. Would you talk a little bit about what you found in terms of race and minority race and ethnicity in the profession with regards to compassion fatigue?
Yes, I would love to. So in African Americans, the prevalence of compassion fatigue was almost double than in those without, and in those with who identified as two or more races, that was more than quadruple. I think I'm saying that right. And so this actually led me down a whole different rabbit hole, because then I got to thinking, well, how much of this is about EMS and how much of this is about being Black in America? What aspect does historical trauma play into the experience of our minority EMS providers? I am a white passing minority, and so it's very easy for people to assume that I am white, but I identify in the two or more races category. I'm only half white, which I think is why I pass so well. But there certainly is historical trauma in my background and generational trauma that literally gets passed down to the point where it is a genetic marker for certain families. And so that's something that I'm going to look at in the future, is kind of teasing out that difference. In different stress disorders, American Indians, Native Americans, or indigenous persons, I hate the word Indian, but that's the federal, definition. So indigenous persons were way more likely to have certain other stress disorders. So I really want to look at that historical trauma aspect in that particular population. So kind of replicating this, but going around the country to tribal EMS services and seeing if the results are similar.
And that's such important work there. And I think I like how you brought in the complexity of this, that it's not we like to have this binary thinking, right? Oh, it's got to be this one cause, it's got to be this one thing. And that's not likely to be true in something like compassion fatigue, that it's multifactorial and it's complex. And I like how you have started to explore some of those. And another thought I had is that, we're starting to build a body of evidence in these topics and what it's like to be a minority race or ethnicity in the field of EMS. And there's some excellent qualitative work that I think complements your study very nicely, from Emily Hutchinson around qualitative interviews on what is it like to be Black in EMS and what are those experiences. So I think this is, you kind of hit the nail on the head. This is the beginning of much more future work to dig in, but there's definitely a signal here of something that warrants further looking into.
Absolutely.
In the next profile, you talk about employment, and this is the one that would come to our minds first of all. And some of this showed up in my burnout work around, what are the factors related to EMS employment that are associated with compassion fatigue? And so you talk about years of experience and shift lengths and types of call. And are there any points that you want to call out for the audience from that employment aspect?
So I think there's some low-hanging fruit in here. If you have 1 to 5 years of EMS field experience, it's not likely at all that you're going to have. So if you're 0 to 5 years old in EMS, it's very unlikely that you'll have compassion fatigue. But once you hit 6 years, going all the way to 20 years, that's when it really starts to skyrocket. And that makes sense, right? Because it's an accumulative stress disorder, so it's going to take time to build. And when you're 0 to 5, you're still a parapup, right? And you're trying to figure out the profession, and you're still excited, and you haven't been jaded, is what the healthcare providers would say. There's a 10% increase in EMS personnel with compassion fatigue who work in EMS full time, as opposed to those who do not. And in the compassion fatigue group, shift length was an average of 1.3 hours longer. So the longer you spend on the truck compared to those who have shorter shifts. And I think that will tie in nicely at some point to Daniel Patterson's work. Yeah. Because Daniel really looks at shift length and sleep and safety and those sorts of things. And there's a huge relationship between stress disorders and sleep, and stress disorders and circadian rhythm fatigue. So that's a whole other rabbit hole that I'm going to go down hopefully very soon as well.
Absolutely.
But in terms of, let me back up to you. In terms of because I don't think we've made it to that chart yet, but in terms of the resources that are available to providers, do they have EAP? Do they have chaplains? Do they have access to CISD? Those sorts of things. None of that stuff was significant, which means everybody knows that stuff is available to them. It's not a lack of available resources. So in other words, it's not the agencies not providing resources that is the problem. I think agencies are dumping resources on people, and there may be some analysis paralysis because there's so much there to choose from. And that's also because everybody knows we have a problem, but we really don't know how to fix it. So we're just going to throw, it's like shotgun medicine. We're just going to throw everything at it until something sticks to the wall.
And I think,
I think, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just think it's important to make that point because I think it would be easy for us to blame our employers. And I really think they're trying to create resources for field personnel.
And I think this is a question I had thought of for us later, but this idea of should we be addressing organizational level factors, individual level actions, or a combination of both? Part of my frustration in the burnout work was that all of these interventions seem to be focused on the individual, like you should go do some yoga, you should go eat right, you should sleep right, you should have work-life balance, but all of that is just pointing at the person who's experiencing the condition. When your work points at there's probably areas where it's kind of a both and situation. There are individual things we can be doing and organizational level things. Do you have any thoughts about some of these things that we should be targeting as organizations in particular?
Well, ending the mental health stigma is important. We've got to get out of this cultural mindset that you know, there's no crying in EMS, and you're not allowed to have feelings, and you know, if you seek help for any problem that you may be experiencing, then you're just a baby. That's just insane. It's insane. Our tactical operators that go overseas and defend our freedom, they take advantage of resources. Their culture is changing. There's way more of them than there are of us. We can change our culture too and make it okay and promote self-care and promote quality mental health. I think we're going to see that flip-flopping shifts is going to end up being a bad thing for stress disorders, although there's no research on that yet. That's something that I hope to do in the future, because it will affect your circadian rhythms to the point where you have too much cortisol in your system and you get adrenal fatigue. And that's just going to contribute to the worsening of all of that. And then I think in EMS, we struggle a lot with lateral violence, and I haven't seen any research on that in EMS. So that's on my list of to-dos too. You see, I got a long list.
You just keep giving yourself more work, and I love it.
I know, and I love it. It's so much fun. Because every time I do something, I'm like, oh, and we could ask this, and we could ask this, and what about this? Yep. So lateral violence it's very common in nursing. And it surrounds this idea of you don't have control over a major portion of your work life. And in EMS, that's kind of what we see, or maybe our shift. And so the way that you reestablish control is you bully someone else, and create this hazing effect that happens in EMS. Right. You know, we always say we eat our own young. That's where that, I think, is coming from, and that needs to be quantified too. And that is an organizational problem. That is not, it stems from individual trauma, right, but that is something that happens at the organizational level because it's allowed to. So nobody knows that needs to be fixed until it's called out. So that research has to be done too.
Such a great point. Jeff.
Sorry to add to the more whatabouts, but something else, again, in your terrific work that you brought up was gallows humor, which I don't think you've discussed just yet, but we all know, I mean, our profession is such a difficult, I mean, we see so many difficult things and never know what you're going to see each day. And I thought it was really interesting how you brought in gallows humor, and that we think it's effective and we think that, you know, it'll help us. So that's why it's so prevalent in EMS, but it's probably not necessarily a good thing. So if you don't mind just telling us a little bit more about it, since maybe we don't all use that term, but it's definitely out there, and I'm curious what about it? Thank you.
Absolutely. So when something happens that's just cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, right? Your brain kind of short circuits and says, I don't know how to process this in a healthy way. The way gallows humor fits in, so it's good and it's bad, because it will help folks process the event, because in essence, it's a form of storytelling. And so by telling the story to someone else, you're starting to process that event. But where it's bad is that you continue to dissociate from the event in an emotional way, and then that kind of keeps you from healthy processing. So it's kind of a twofold issue, that it is both good and bad. You know, you may need to externally process what you've seen in the form of storytelling, but everybody knows if you want to keep somebody's interest, it's got to be an engaging, funny story. So we kind of inject that callousness in there that separates us from the emotion of it, and that results in that unhealthy mechanism.
Right. It's interesting how the symptoms and the coping mechanisms tend to blend with some of these stress disorders. And so I would be remiss if I encourage the audience to participate and then don't take their questions. So I'm going to dive into some of the
Right.
audience questions. You're getting a
Let's
lot of
do that.
kudos and accolades in there if you would like us to also grow your head some more. But one of the questions relates to this concept of moral injury. And so compassion fatigue, burnout often begin with this concept of moral injury. And so do you think it would be, beneficial if we manage the scenarios to prevent moral injury? Would we have better, earlier interventions for some of these stress disorders?
So I just had a conversation about this the other day, and yes is the short answer. But I'm not just going to give you a short answer, really.
Please don't.
I think there's an appropriate way to do it, and this is just my professional opinion. Having a frank, open, raw, vulnerable discussion with folks, I think, is an absolutely acceptable way to do this. Not forcing people to engage if they don't want to. We've seen that with CISD that is disastrous. With the military, so I'm an Army wife. My husband's been in the Army for the last 18 years. And some of the things that they do in the military, I'll just say the military, so I'm not calling out the Army, are just insane. They're just ridiculous. So they wanted to, when everybody was going overseas and it was, a lot of combat operations going on, they would desensitize soldiers by putting them in this miniature city and then moulaging soldiers and like blowing them up and simulating amputations and screaming and simulating a war environment before they went to war with the goal of desensitizing them so that they don't get PTSD on the way back in, which to me, I kind of understand the concept, but the human factors part of me is, okay, so we traumatize them so that we could send them over to Iraq to traumatize them. That doesn't, it just didn't compute, I think it was just like, oh, this will be fun. We'll do this giant simulation and it won't be boring and it won't be the classroom and hooray. And I don't think that we thought beyond the implications of even simulated events can traumatize people.
Right.
And affect them for the rest of their lives. So I think there are right ways to do it and wrong ways to do it.
Absolutely. Excellent points. And we have another question, this time from Greg, and it's talking about the high turnover rate that we experience in EMS. So sometimes the data that we see are as important as the data that we don't see. Is it possible that there are a lot of people leaving the profession with compassion fatigue after serving just a few years of service, and that the ones who are remaining are the ones who are not experiencing compassion fatigue?
That is absolutely possible. I think probably what is more likely is that a primary stress disorder has occurred, because unless they were really at risk before they got in, I just don't see compassion fatigue setting in a year or two. But I do see the potential for, a vicarious trauma or a PTSI or a complex PTSI developing in that short amount of time that might drive folks into another profession. And we're seeing it really a lot right now because of the way COVID was handled, and the PPE shortages, and people in all facets of healthcare are just fleeing the scene because they're exhausted and they're traumatized. And so, I do think it's possible that there are people that could have been in this sample that weren't, but I don't know that compassion fatigue would be the cause. I won't say it isn't, but just based on the pathophysiology, I don't think it's likely.
Makes sense.
I wanted to jump in. I just because
you and Bill will have to fight.
Yeah, we always do, and that's okay. But I always win. So the thing about vicarious trauma was really interesting for me in Atlanta when you presented this at the symposium, was that I didn't really understand vicarious trauma. And for those that are on the podcast or listening to this after, I just wanted to make sure, because that term is actually a real thing, not just like something you invented, just 'cause. And since that day, I've been thinking a lot about that vicarious trauma, and it has to do with kind of the effect that witnessing or being part of something or hearing about something has on you. And that concept that, you know, even though the assault that the patient that was assaulted, the assault wasn't perpetrated on you, you have some emotion around, gosh, I'm seeing this person who was assaulted, whether it's a child, a loved one, or a friend, or even at work, just the repeated exposure to these things. And that micro trauma that keeps adding up, where you start to go, yeah, I actually kind of built up a defense against this so that I could just keep coping with. I go to a lot of assaults. That happens every Friday night, Saturday night, all day long. So here we are taking care of another person who's in a domestic dispute. And so that's just the category in my head. And sometimes you're able to just sort of kind of make these boxes, but this compassion fatigue piece, I think in particular, at least I'll speak personally, during COVID it really got to me. I was able to, I think, compartmentalize and still be very compassionate. But people that rip your mask off and cough at you, and I gotta say, that was just like, I'm done. I sit on that stretcher and don't talk to me. So it's when it, kind of became a bit more of a, I've never really experienced this level of, I don't care what's going on with you. I just need to survive here. And I wonder if you can, just speak a little bit about that in terms of that, that association between the vicarious trauma and the compassion fatigue.
Sure. First of all, I'm sorry that you experienced that, Dave. Really.
Yeah.
I think that, and then you get this, oh, I care way less than I used to. Now you feel guilty about, so that now you've got this whole other like layer of self-deprecation that you've added on. Now you're not just traumatized and exhausted, but you're blaming yourself for not being on your A game, and that's just awful for anyone. I think it's very easy, I found some headlines when I was doing my research for this in like actual newspapers that still exist. That a paramedic stops to buy sunglasses on the way to an emergency call, or a paramedic gets suspended because he punches. I have it pulled up over here on my other monitor. That a paramedic gets suspended for punching a patient, or there was a big issue on I-95 in South Carolina where a mentally ill man was who died because he wasn't treated. And so I think it's very easy to go, well, those people never should have been in EMS to begin with. They're just terrible people. They were rogue employees. We just missed them on the way in. And that may be true. It's possible, right? But what's also possible is that they were so exhausted and so traumatized that they just snapped. And in that sense, if we are just calling them terrible employees, not only are we making it worse on their mental health, but we're not helping them either. The analogy I like to use for vicarious trauma is a stillbirth. You go to a call as a paramedic, you deliver a baby who is stillborn. It's a death. You have to treat the mother. It's traumatizing. And then for the next month, every time you see a Pampers commercial, you burst into tears for no reason. You can't be around anything baby related. You don't want to see your nephews or nieces or your kids. You experience that grief the same way the patient experiences it. It's emotional transference, countertransference, really, because the patient's giving it to you. It's seen a lot in therapists and clinicians and, now EMS. So you're carrying that grief on top of dealing with all this stress. And so if you've got both things going on at the same time, that really can kind of drive you batty after a while.
Absolutely. Well, I think Dr. Toon seated his question.
Yeah, Bill just got scared.
I was going to let one more go before I took this out.
Well, no, I think it is time for us to go. I know that, so I'll have to save mine for another time. But at some point, I do think it's important we discuss, or out there is what would be effective mechanisms in EMS education programs to begin to work on preparing people for the realism of the field. You know, a saying I've always said, don't become a firefighter if you don't expect to go inside a burning building. You know, same thing with someone who joins the military. Don't join the military if you think you're never going to have to go to war. You know, you just shouldn't do things like that. So I do think during our educational process, we probably can put in place some very valid things that will help us build resiliency or grit, whichever term that you'd like to use, within people so they can have a good career. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. Beautiful work. Wonderful to share. I could discuss for many hours with you. So.
Absolutely. And I
Thank
hope
you.
this is the first of many discussions around this topic. And so, Ginny, I will give you opportunity. Any last words that you would like our audience to leave with before I carry us out? The time has flown by today.
Yes, it has. So I just like to share a quote with you all that I think is very appropriate for what we've been talking about today in terms of where this stuff comes from. And that is, and I can't attribute this to any one person. I found it on the internet and it wasn't attributed to anybody. And so unfortunately I can't cite the author, but I didn't become an EMT to get a front row seat to other people's tragedies. I did it because the world was bleeding and so was I. And somewhere inside, I knew the only way to stop my own bleeding was to learn how to stop someone else's.
Very powerful. Thank you again for sharing your time with us, this incredible research, and for your candor and truly keeping people behind the numbers. I want to thank all of you listeners for your questions, and I hope that we can keep this conversation going and keep the stigma out. But unfortunately, we have reached the end of our hour. Dave, do you have a last thing before we go? Oh, I saw him pop.
No, don't let him speak.
Thank you. We love you. Thank you. Great job.
Absolutely. And for all of you who just can't get enough of research, as a reminder, we are going to be back here with the Education Research Journal Club on Friday, February 25th. And the Clinical Research Journal Club will be back the second Monday of the month, which would be March 14th. So thank you all for listening. Thank you again, Dr. Renkiewicz, and we look forward to talking about the research next time.